This is the fourth and final part of The Long Shadow, an interview with Bruce Perry from The Sun magazine. This begins at the top of page 29. Supin, some have suggested that birth itself is traumatic. Do you agree? Harry, I would agree that birth involves an extreme activation of the stress response, which results in an alteration in the stress response systems. So, using that earlier definition, yes, being born is a frightening experience. It's a huge change in your environment. In utero, you are mostly regulated. Your world is dark, wet, warm, and full of calories and oxygen. You have pretty much all you need to keep your brainstem happy. Then you get pushed out of that environment. There's a period during birth when you don't get enough oxygen. It's probably as if you were drowning. Absolutely terrifying. Birth also involves moving through a tight space, which hurts. Finally, there is this sensory transition. All of a sudden, your environment is 72 degrees instead of 98.7. You see sights you've never seen before, and you hear sounds differently, and the rhythm of your mother's heart is gone. Even if your mother does everything right, you'll have a huge stress response. The first time you feel an ice cold wipe go up your rump, no matter how much the person ching you smiles and says you're beautiful, you think, what the hell is this? But as I've said before, this sort of stress isn't necessarily a bad thing when you have a ton of caregivers. You're hungry, so you cry, and somebody feeds you, and you get back to baseline. You're cold, so you cry, and somebody comes and holds you, and you get back to baseline. You experience thousands of these sources of stress in the first few years. This is when your infant brain begins to make an association between a human face, calm tone of voice, a loving touch, and the relief of physiological distress. Later on, when you meet somebody and he or she smiles at you, you feel good, even if it's a new person or a novel situation. In the lower, less evolved region of the brain, where an experience gets marked familiar or unfamiliar, the brain says, this is a good person. And if I expect you to be good, I'll project warm, positive signals of engagement. Because human emotions are contagious, I will elicit from you what I project. As children get older and come into new environments, their past experiences that people are kind, willing to smile and be open to interactions. If people smile back, that reinforces this worldview, building an even bigger catalog of positive experiences. When the child occasionally encounters somebody who's not friendly, it doesn't undo all of that. Supin, traumatic experiences contribute to addiction. Perry, to answer that, we first need to understand addiction. The brain's reward systems cause us to feel pleasure when stimulated. Typically, there are many ways we can activate those reward systems during our day, most importantly by having a positive human interaction. For a child with few loving relationships, it's hard to find those types of rewards. Maybe he's in a classroom where he's not allowed to move, and there's no music or other pleasurable sensory input. He isn't in the in group and sits by himself at lunch. After school, he goes home. Mom and dad are both working, so the kid turns on the TV and starts to eat, even though he's not hungry. He'll eat Dorito after Dorito because the salt and fat can stimulate the reward networks. Ultimately, he gains weight. As he gets older, he learns about online porn. He can masturbate, and that feels good for a while. Or if he learns that if he drinks, it will make him less anxious. Or he might use some drug to artificially stimulate the reward systems in the brain. Probability that you'll engage in unhealthy forms of reward increases when your stress response system is sensitized from trauma. So a child who has experienced trauma and lacks healthy relationships is primed once he's introduced to alcohol or drugs later in life to use them again and again and again. For somebody who has these vulnerabilities, relationship-based interventions like Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous are usually what works. They aren't perfect, but they're an opportunity to have human contact pretty much anytime you want. You can go to a meeting. You can call your sponsor. Community-based interventions also help. Building a therapeutic web and repairing fractured relationships makes all the difference. Supin, when a child is a bully or behaves violently, how do you tell whether trauma is fueling the behavior? Perry, you might guess it's not easily. As you might guess, it's not easy. In general, if a child is aggressive toward other children, that's behavior the child is seeing at home. Frequently, children who humiliate and degrade vulnerable peers have themselves been made to feel small and degraded by a parent or sibling. It'd be rare for someone to be a consistent bully without having either seen that behavior or experienced it in some way. How come some kids who experience bullying become bullies and others don't? Perry, that's a great question. Often in families in which two kids are abused, I'll find that one becomes aggressive and the other becomes a protector. probably have 10 families I'm working with right now, in which one grown sibling is a cop or a social worker, and another is in prison or has a substance abuse problem. I could speculate about that, but there's a lot more we need to learn first. I do know that nothing is inevitable. There's a pathway out of these traumatizing environments. I've seen a tremendous range of responses to both good and bad experiences. I might work with one child who's troubled despite having had all kinds of wonderful opportunities, and another child who's had a rough life, yet is humane, kind, and doing well in school. Again, I don't know why this is. One of the most important variables, in my experience, is when things happen. If you experience emotionally disengaged caregiving, humiliation, or a sense of being unwanted in the first year or two of life, even if you then escape that environment, maybe you're adopted, or your parent who is depressed gets better, that early experience can still cause profound social and emotional problems for you all the way into adulthood. On the other hand, kids who have a good first year of consistent, predictable caregiving and then end up in shelters or foster homes and bounce around the system, maybe get sexually and physically abused, and so on, those children often function reasonably well as adolescents. The brain develops very rapidly, both in utero and for the first couple of years after birth. In utero, especially, you're making a lot of neurons. In fact, the majority of the neurons in your brain were created in the womb. You continue to make neurons throughout life. Today, you might make 200. But there are periods in utero when you make 20,000 neurons per second. The foundation of the brain's architecture is mostly formed in the first couple of years of life. So then, what helps build that foundation? Very. The heart of all human development is the relationship you have with your primary caregivers. If you're getting adequate nutrition and appropriate doses of touch, talk, eye contact, and so on, then you'll achieve your genetic potential. The genes basically provide the blueprint, and the experiences make that blueprint a reality. For example, you can have the genetic capability for language, but if nobody ever speaks to you, you will not develop speech. Supin, are there periods in early childhood when it's easier to acquire a skill like language? Perry, there's a typical developmental sequence children go through. We do know that children can acquire skills out of sequence. The development of cognitive skills, such as language, is somewhat dependent on whether a child's social and emotional needs are met at that same stage of development. For example, there's a point when children need to be held and rocked, and also a stage when they don't need that as much anymore. I think early childhood education right now is overemphasizing cognitive development and selling short social and emotional development. You read a preschooler a story at night, you begin to associate reading with comfort and pleasure. They'll start to identify letters and words and won't have any trouble learning to read before kindergarten. But a child who learns to read at the age of 5 through repetition, this is an A, this is a B, this is a C, won't enjoy reading because it isn't fun. You're not pairing reading with pleasure, with being in the lap of somebody who loves you, feeling that warmth with laughing and goofing around becomes a completely different experience. Supin, what do you think of the notion that some people are just born bad? Perry, I do not believe anyone is born bad. There's no credible evidence that sociopathy is genetic. It may be that there are genetic components that contribute to a difficulty developing empathy for others. That does not necessarily make the person bad. I know a number of people who have a hard time understanding others' feelings, but have a firm sense of right and wrong and act in responsible ways. Supin, what about someone who commits a heinous, violent act? Would your first instinct be to look for signs of traumatic experience that might have motivated that behavior? Perry, well, it might not be a traumatic experience that led to it, but I do think the best way to understand people is to find out their stories. Where did they come from? What was their family like? What happened within their community? I've interviewed a number of people on death row who committed horrible crimes. I can't always put my finger on a single event, but it's rare that after hearing an inmate's story, I don't have a clue why he is there. Frequently, I'll see multiple experiences that might have contributed to it. Almost always, the inmate's story includes being marginalized by a group he wanted to be a part of. Many of the worst serial killers were humiliated, degraded, and marginalized by a parent. Many school shooters felt marginalized or humiliated by their peer group. Anyone who is marginalized, for whatever reason, have a much higher baseline level of distress. In most early human cultures, the worst punishment wasn't the death penalty, it was banishment. Human beings are meant to be in groups. For the majority of the time we've been on this planet, we've lived in relatively small tribes or clans, and our major competitors have been other human beings. So our species' great gift for relationships is a double-edged sword. It has enabled us to join together, but it's also given us the instinct to create an us and a them, often with toxic consequences. Someone's unfamiliar, our default response is defensive. Our tendency to view novelty as potentially threatening leads to hateful beliefs about people who have, say, a different skin color. In the US, white people have labeled many cultures as them: immigrants, Africans, Americans, Native Americans. Supin. So the antidote so the antidote to this is for people to have good experiences with the groups they fear. Perry, right. The challenge is that fear shuts down the reasoning and reflective part of our brain. We're less likely to be open to those new experiences when we're afraid. We're also much more compliant toward authority. We're more easily led and apt to act in ways that violate our own values. We see this at play in our politics, in our communities, in our schools when there's an in group and an out group. The desire to stay in the in group will cause some of us to follow a bully and do things we'd never have done on our own. I don't want to extend this too far. You could say that many of the policies and practices instituted in the US after 9/11 were accepted only because citizens were fearful. I believe people in positions of power are conscious of this. Fear is the most common reason that our brain shuts down, but exhaustion, hunger, and thirst have a similar effect. If you're tired and poor, you're less able to think about the future of humankind. It's hard to be reflective if you don't know where your child's next meal is coming from. Your brain says, get food first. If you can't find a safe place to raise your children, then reflection and learning probably seem like indulgences you can't afford. This isn't about biology or genetics, it's about the relative health and richness of our relationships and environments. Busyness can also shut down our higher reasoning. Being overscheduled and living in an overstimulating environment, the TV always on, the phone buzzing, loud cars driving by. Supin, if headline news is perpetually on, you may think it's making you smarter, Perry, but basically it's making you dumber. It's continually bombarding you and distracting you from thinking. You're unable to reflect on what you're hearing, and you end up believing anything you were told on TV. This is compounded when news stories are emotionally charged. Just hearing a story delivered in a more emotional tone of voice or with an intense image will hinder our ability to absorb and reflect on that information. It's the reflective part of the brain that helps us heal. It's the part that makes us most human. The end.